Welcome to this second video on Integrative Person-Centred Counselling. Today we're going to focus on psychoanalysis and how we can integrate the theory and practice of psychoanalysis into a person-centred frame. Historically, these two ideas are separated by a huge fence, and lots of theorists and practitioners see them as completely opposing forces in the psychotherapy world. So my intention is to show that not only can they coexist harmoniously, but they can work together in the pursuit of supporting the client. The person-centered approach to therapy rests on the belief that human beings, when offered a relationship of empathy, authenticity, and unconditional acceptance, tend to move toward growth. But many of us psychotherapists know that clients will return the next week and the week after in very similar patterns, ways of thinking, ways of behaving, that in a sense aren't empathized out of them. And what psychoanalysis does is says there's an explanation for that, which is underneath the client's experience is this unconscious world. And by understanding that unconscious world, they can grow more understanding of the self, more awareness, and that then leads them into a healthier state of being. Psychoanalysis was famously invented by Sigmund Freud, and he was treating patients with bizarre, unexplained physical symptoms, things like paralysis or hysteria, that the medical field had very little information on how to treat. But by talking with these patients and listening to their experience, he found that the symptoms reduced, subsided, and often cured just by the presence of a listening other. And this was around the turn of the 1900s, where Sigmund Freud invented the talking cure, and psychoanalysis became the primary model for understanding it. So let's have a look at the model, and then I'll try to show you how this may integrate with a person-centered frame. Now, what Freud noticed is that, first of all, the mind is structured into three parts. The first, which he termed the id, is responsible for all of the impulses and instincts that drive conscious life. That is to say that at our baseline, we have certain needs that seek immediate gratification, something that Freud called the pleasure principle. So if you imagine a child who is hungry, it's almost like this need for hunger, the body's response to hunger, needs to be immediately satisfied. And anything between the need coming up and the satisfaction of that need is experienced as pain, as unpleasure, as he originally called it. Now, the environment, if it's responsive enough, helps the child to learn to tolerate those difficult feelings. And the id, this unconscious part of the mind where the needs sit, is essentially in harmony with the child's physical body. But a child who grows up with harsh conditions, perhaps parents who are abusive, parents who are neglectful, learns that these needs, in some sense, must be guarded from. And this reality develops into a second part of the mind that Freud termed the ego. And the ego is governed by the reality principle, which is that our reality cannot immediately meet our needs straight away. And this is more conscious. We're more consciously aware of the world around us, not necessarily of the underlying needs that govern the way we experience the world. So this child that's experienced harsh parenting will inevitably start to deny many of those internal needs. That might be a need for hunger, it might be a need for comfort, it might be a need for proximity to a caregiver. So when their reality perceives this need, when they start to feel like they need something, they push it down and they guard against it. And this is what Freud said is the start of, as he called it, the neurosis, but essentially the client's psychological symptoms. that all anxiety, depression, and other things that we experience in the room can be partially explained by an inner conflict between what we need and what we think our reality can give to us. Now, later in childhood, a third part of the mind begins to show itself, and this is what Freud termed the superego. Not because it kind of has superpowers and it can sense things, beyond awareness, but because it supervises the ego. It's like an internal supervisor that tells the reality the person is experiencing how it should be. Is it okay for me to reach for help? Is it okay for me to seek support? Is it okay for me to feel rejected? And if, again, the child is nurtured throughout the early years of life, then the superego develops flexibility and is a kind of supervisor that's quite sensitive, quite nice, an internal voice that becomes nurturing. But the child who grows up in an environment where things are very critical, stressful, tense, depressed, anxious, this internal supervisor becomes quite chaotic, restrictive, authoritarian, and often quite harsh. That is to say that when we experience reality, what Freud added is that there are two components of the unconscious. One is, what are our immediate needs within this situation, and how are we supervising those needs to make them permissible or unacceptable to our conscious self. And this is why psychoanalysis is a model of conflict, because we have our needs, we have the reality that we're situated in, and we have this internal moral judge that tells us the rights and wrongs in the world around us. Freud showed that when the client is experiencing a psychological problem, it's really down to this internal conflict, and that creating harmony between the different parts of the mind will increase health, increase growth, increase awareness. So in person-centered therapy, we are trying to help the person move from incongruence of their experience to congruence, that growth comes through accepting experience. And Freud agrees with this in a sense. They use very different language, but what Freud is saying is that often the things that you need are in conflict with the things you could have, and it are also in conflict with the things that you judge to be worthwhile or acceptable. And I think this adds a really important richness to my person-centered work, because when I'm working with a client, often I'll experience that the more empathy I'm trying to provide, the more I'm trying to be present with the client, the more they are becoming dissociated, becoming detached from me as a person. And I might try to name that, I might try to sit with that, but in doing so, in being a good therapist, I'm experienced as a bad therapist. What's happening is that maybe this person needs me, really they need me, but they didn't have that need met in early childhood. So they've developed a system where when they start to experience that need, they want to shut it down. And they do that in the session by shutting me down. And Freud had a term for this, which was called transference. So you see this internal conflict come out in the way that the client transfers those previous relationships onto you as a therapist. When I'm being myself and I'm thinking I'm being empathic, and 4 other clients that week have really experienced me in a positive way, and I do the same thing with this client, and suddenly I feel like I'm a horrible person, I feel like I can't understand them, I feel like I'm interrogating them, asking question and question and question. What is likely happening is that this is an experience that they've had in early childhood, and that's being transferred onto me. So they can't access my empathy because it's too dangerous and it's too risky, and it brings out a need in them that they just can't seem to acknowledge. Typically, psychoanalysis will use interpretations, and in next week's video we'll talk about how to do that in a person-centered way. But the way that I integrate this is by taking the theory from Freud and integrating it into the practice of person-centered therapy. That is to say, I am accepting the client for who they are, I'm being with them as much as I possibly can and I'm being authentic, but I'm holding in mind that beneath what they're reporting to me might be these unconscious drives that are interrupting how they're experiencing me as a therapist. So by analysing the transference relationship, looking at how they respond to me, to my care, to my questions, to my empathy, I get some understanding of what life has been like for them in the past. Another term that comes in useful here is countertransference. And I think this is incredibly useful as a person-centred therapist. Carl Rogers really disagreed with this and said, he made the claim actually that he didn't experience transference in the room with clients. Now, I have to say that I know that to be false, just having seen countless videos of Carl Rogers. I mean, there's many times where he's doing perfectly well in sitting with the client's feelings, and the client is pushing them away more and more. The way that Rogers understood this in his defense was to say that the client is incongruent to their experience. So they might be experiencing on some level empathy, but they can't sort of absorb it, they can't integrate it into their awareness, and that the more that Carl does this, the more the client can become congruent with it. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of overcoming this thing that he experiences in the room. But I think we shouldn't chuck out what Freud noticed, which is that the client also draws us in to respond in a way that replicates the old patterns in their childhood. That is to say that the transference gets put onto me, and then I start to experience myself as an unhelpful caregiver, and then I start to respond in a way that is unhelpful. So due to my own tolerance levels, for example, I might start to try and rescue the client, I might start to solve the problem for them, and then I might start to become controlling. And noticing what's happening between me and the client in this transference and countertransference relationship, I think can really help me to stay more empathic with what the client's experience is. So for me, the integration between psychoanalysis and person-centered approach starts with acknowledging that there is an unconscious presence in the room. This is not about psychoanalysis in terms of the analysis part being the intervention. It's about, in your mind as a therapist, holding on to what might be the conflict here in the way the client is responding to me. What am I feeling? What am I experiencing and being drawn into? And how might this help us to resolve some of the client's incongruence? How might it help us to empathize a bit more with what they're experiencing? So hopefully that gives you a snapshot of what I cover in the book, which is that psychoanalysis can be a useful aid to person-centered approaches when we stick with the core conditions and be present with the client. Next week, we'll build on this by looking at defense mechanisms. So these are the things that kick in when the mind can't tolerate its own needs, for example. But for now, hopefully that's been an interesting introduction to the integration of psychoanalysis and person-centered therapy, and I'll see you in the next video.